Good things are happening, great things are happening, so why does it feel like nothing? Did that ever happen to you, that something takes place in your life and you don't react the way you were supposed to react? A month ago, we had the opening night of a play. We've been working for 2 years. A lot of work with this group of beautiful people. Very interesting exploration, research, rehearsal, and finally we got to the opening night and it was great. It was crowded, the room was full, and I was happy, and I was happy, content, satisfied. I was not so excited. I was a little excited, but not so excited as I thought I was going to be. I mean, it's a 2-year work, it's my first play as a playwright and director, and I'm happy with the work, but I'm not excited. I'm not so excited about this thing that's happening, this success. Let's use that word. We are living something that we can classify as a successful moment, but I'm not excited as I was supposed to be. Writer Kurt Vonnegut speaks about this in a very eloquent and beautiful and funny, very funny way in his famous lecture, The Shape of Stories, that you can find in YouTube very easily. Vonnegut explains how storytelling, how classical storytelling, we can understand it as structured upon a 2 axes, where one is time and the other one is the axis of good and bad fortune. So the stories usually begins at some point in this axis, and as time goes by, they go up and down and up and down. And for example, Cinderella starts very low because she has nothing, and then this miracle happens and she becomes this kind of a princess, so it goes up, but then the miracle breaks and she goes down, and so on. And well, Vonnegut gives different examples until he gets to Hamlet by Shakespeare, which is a play, a very rich play, very complex play, where, as Vonnegut suggests, you cannot, as a reader or a viewer, tell exactly if things happening in the play are good news or bad news. So Vonnegut asks himself and the audience, is it because Shakespeare was a lousy, terrible writer, playwright? And he answers no. He was actually saying something quite deep about human condition, which is that we cannot tell. We cannot actually tell for sure if things are good news or bad news. We never know enough. And that connects me with this famous Taoist story, maybe you know it, about this old man from the country that has a horse, and one day the horse gets lost. We can connect this with the video about getting lost and the value of losing and getting lost. You can watch this other video if you want. At first, when the horse gets lost, people, neighbors, people come and they say, "Oh, you lost your horse, too bad." And the man, this old man, the owner of the horse, the lost horse, answers, "Too bad, too good, too bad, who knows?" So people leave, and the next day, the horse comes back to the man's house and brings these other horses that he or she found wherever in the mountain. So now the man, instead of having only one horse, has, let's say, 10 horses. So the people come and of course say, "Wow, now you have 10 horses, great news." And the man answers, "Great news, bad news, who knows?" Okay, the people leave. What's happening with him? They leave. The next day, this man's son, his son, is trying to tame these new horses, these new wild horses, and in doing so he breaks his leg. He gets hurt. So people come, and of course they say, too bad. People represents common sense. Of course, if the kid, his leg broke, of course we are gonna think, too bad. But the man, as always, answers too bad, too good. Who knows? People leave. The next day or a few days after, who knows? The army comes to recruit, is that a word? To take this kid to war. But as the kid was hurt, they cannot take him to war. So people come, they were not so patriotic, apparently, and they see the army couldn't take the man's son to war, and they say, hey, great news. And of course the man says, great news, bad news, who knows? And so on. The story can keep going day after day. And who knows? Who knows? Can we for a moment stop this belief that we know what good news and bad news are? What happens to us when we get, at least for a moment, disconnected from this dualistic way of perceiving, understanding life? What happens to our lives and our narrative, our storytelling, when we de-identify, we suspend the identification with this ups and downs narrative? That's the way ego works and culture works. Ego and culture, being collective ego, works based upon the structure, this dualistic structure of ups and downs. And I'm not saying that should end for good. I'm just wondering and asking you, what happens when we suspend, put on hold, the identification process with that up and down narrative structure and worldview? What would narrative and life would be like if we were not so attached to that way of looking at things? What do they already look like or feel like when we don't fixate that much to this emotional roller coaster? Is it necessary for us to always be so attached to that roller coaster? Can we, when we're watching a movie or reading a novel or listening to someone in life telling something that happened to them, we usually agree on what is good news and bad news. So what happens when we are not that triggered? Can you think of a scene in a movie or a book where something happens and you cannot tell whether it's good or bad for the character? I love these moments. I always think of writing scenes about good news crashing with bad news. And I remember this moment in this series, it's called Love Life with Anna Kendrick. There's a scene where she gets a job she was looking for, and at the same time her partner, her boyfriend, gets fired from the restaurant he worked in. So they meet at home, and she comes happy with the news that she got her job. So it's very interesting what happens when the two pieces of good news and bad news collide. But in that case, in that scenario, it's clear which one is the good one and which one is the bad one. But it's very interesting what happens with them in the collision, in the crashing of those two news. But I'm wondering here, what happens when these things happen, when situations take place in our lives, when we cannot tell exactly whether it's good or bad? When that frame, when that worldview, that mindset the dualistic mindset gets hijacked or threatened. There is a scene near the end of season 1 in Mad Men, the series, where we can find this complexity. As you know, Mad Men is about an advertising company, and there's a scene where power dynamics take place between 3 characters, and it's very interesting to investigate. So let's look at the scene deeply. Peggy is this sweet soul in the middle of this bitter and cynical universe of men. So when she starts going up, it's easy for us to relate. As you know, the series begins with her arriving at the firm, at the company as a new secretary. So we, in a way, also get into this universe with her. And her rise will be one of the most important arcs in the series. So by the end of season 1, getting a promotion feels like good news, both for her and for us, because we've been walking this trail with her all along the season. The thing is, Don Draper, her boss, gives her the promotion also to bother Pete. And probably because he wants to bother Pete, they are having this meeting, and probably because he wants to bother Pete, he gives the promotion to Peggy, because Don knows that Pete is clearly not happy with Peggy being a copywriter and ascending. So the scene is very awkward. Pete brings a new account to the company. Part of their job is to bring new clients to the company, and there's a lot of pressure over them to bring new people, so Pete could finally bring someone, so he's all proud of himself. But Don won't let him be just happy at the top. So he calls Peggy in and informs her she's now a copywriter and no longer not a secretary anymore. So the triangle is complex and very interesting. Pete feels off, betrayed, offended, so he leaves the room. And Peggy, even when she feels she can perceive there's something else happening there, she's happy and she accepts the promotion. Don's position is the most interesting one, because he's doing with the same action both a good and a bad thing. A great example of how a situation can be both good and bad news. We feel sorry for Pete, we feel happy for Peggy, but what do we feel about Don's way of handling things? Of course, if we go deeper into the situation, we must remember that 1 or 2 episodes before, Pete tried to extort Don by threatening with revealing his secret identity. So if we see Don's move as a revenge, we can see Don's move as a revenge here and enjoy it as a revenge. But it's not that easy, because we are also relating to Pete's situation, and a revenge works when we identify with the one taking revenge. As in Joker, in Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, we enjoy his revenge, we enjoy when he shoots Robert De Niro in the face, because we are only identifying with him as a victim. That's a simplification, a simplistic way of storytelling, but that's not what Mad Men does. Mad Men is all about celebrating human complexity. Of course, there are moments where we can find simplification, because it's very hard not to fall into the trap. Simplification is part of what we do as humans, but in general, I would argue that Mad Men is quite a deep and crazy celebration of human complexity. So this scene is a very good example of that complexity. We understand Pete, we know his attempt to extort Don wasn't coming out of evil, pure evil, but out of desperation and insecurity. Pete is a very insecure young guy trying to ascend. So we can relate, at least I can relate to his situation and feel empathy for him too. So yes, it's quite a complex situation in a very complex narrative. This scene is a great example of how the framework of good and bad news is not always useful. And it's a great example of human complexity, as I was saying, the whole series and particularly this scene. And I mean, the complexity of this scene is, above all, in Don's action. Because Peggy wins and Pete loses. But what about Don? If Peggy wins and Pete loses, what about Don? How do we viewers react to his move? There are moments in our lives when we find ourselves in those situations where ambiguity takes over. And it's very precious and rich when we find that in film, in literature, in theater. So I leave you with this question. Can you think of stories both in film and literature or theater not so based upon this dualistic worldview? If you know of any scenes or movies or short story or novels or whatever, if you think of any examples of that, please leave them in the comments so we can probably make a list and study this possibility of human narrative not being so conditioned by the survival dualistic mode of ups and downs. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll meet again in the next video.